The year is 541 AD. The sun has already been dim for 5 years, hidden behind a mysterious veil of grey fog that turns summer into winter. Crops have failed. Famine is everywhere. But the darkness was only the beginning. Something far worse than hunger is coming up the Nile on grain ships, an invisible traveller that will empty the cities of the world and leave half of Europe in a silent grave. To understand the apocalypse of 541 AD, you first have to understand that the world was already ending. 5 years prior, in 536 AD, a massive volcanic cataclysm, likely in Iceland or North America, threw a blanket of ash into the atmosphere. History remembers it as the year without a sun. The Roman historian Procopius wrote that the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon, during this whole year. Temperatures plummeted, plunging Europe and Asia into a decade-long volcanic winter. In early Anglo-Saxon England and the fractured remains of Roman Britain, harvests rotted in the fields. People were starving, weak and cold. They believed they were being punished by God, but the true punishment hadn't even started yet. It began in the port city of Pelusium, Egypt, the breadbasket of the Emperor Justinian's vast Byzantine Empire. It didn't look like an army, but it moved like one. It hid in the fur of black rats, carried by fleas that gorged themselves on the blood of the infected, then hopped onto human hosts. When it struck, it was unlike anything the ancient doctors had ever seen. Victims would feel a sudden, mild fever, deceptive, almost gentle at first. But within days, the horror set in. Massive, hard swellings called buboes would erupt in the groin, armpits or neck, sometimes growing to the size of an apple. These black, gangrenous lumps were the hallmark of Yersinia pestis, the same bacteria that would return 800 years later as the Black Death. But this was the first time the world met the plague. The suffering was absolute. Some victims slipped into a deep, silent coma. Others went mad with delirium, screaming that they saw demons coming to drag them away. In Constantinople, the heart of the empire, the social order collapsed overnight. Procopius, who witnessed the carnage firsthand, recorded that at its peak, 10,000 people were dying every single day. There was no room to bury them. The city stopped smelling like incense and spices and began to smell only of death. Bodies were stacked inside the guard towers of the city walls, pressed down like grapes in a wine press, until a foul black sludge began to leak out from the cracks in the masonry. The Emperor Justinian himself caught the disease, falling into a deep coma, leaving his wife, Empress Theodora, to rule over a city of ghosts. While he survived, his empire effectively died. The Plague of Justinian didn't stop at the city gates. It boarded the merchant ships and travelled west, hunting for new victims. It moved along the trade routes of the Mediterranean, struck Italy, climbed into Gaul, modern-day France, and eventually crossed the Channel to the mist-shrouded island of Britain. The British Isles, already reeling from the climate collapse and political chaos, were about to face a biological storm that would empty villages and silence the land for generations. The Yellow Plague, as the Welsh and Irish chroniclers would later call it, had arrived to finish what the cold winter had started. The plague didn't arrive in Britain as a conquering army with banners flying. It arrived in the hulls of merchant ships docking at Tintagel and the trading ports of Dumnonia, modern-day Cornwall. We often think of this era, the so-called Dark Ages, as isolated and muddy, but 6th century Britain was still deeply connected to the Mediterranean world. Archaeologists have found pottery from Turkey and North Africa in these coastal fortresses, proving that the Britons were trading tin and slaves for oil, wine, and luxury goods. Tragically, they imported their own extinction alongside that wine. When the infection disembarked around 544 AD, historians date the arrival slightly later than the continental outbreak, it found a land that was perfectly primed for disaster. The Romano-British population, the people who would later inspire the legends of King Arthur, were living in closer quarters, maintaining the last vestiges of Roman town life and church gatherings. This social cohesion, usually a strength, became their fatal weakness. The fleas didn't care about nobility or valor. They simply hopped from the rats in the granaries to the lords in the halls. In the Welsh annals and Irish chronicles, this pestilence was often called the pestis flava, or the yellow plague, describing a jaundice that yellowed the skin of the dying, though modern DNA analysis confirms it was indeed Yersinia pestis, the bubonic plague. The horror that unfolded in the British Isles was intimate and terrifying. Entire monastic communities, the keepers of history and literacy, were wiped out in days. We have records of abbots and kings falling alike, most famously Maelgwn Gwynedd, the powerful king of Gwynedd, who, according to legend, saw the yellow monster through a keyhole in the church where he had sought sanctuary and died instantly. This is the folklore of trauma. The reality was that he likely died screaming in a sweat-soaked bed, his lymph nodes bursting with infection. The death toll was staggering. While exact census data is lost to time, the archaeological record shows a sudden, violent contraction. Cemeteries from this period expand rapidly, filled with multiple burials, hasty graves dug by survivors who were too weak to dig deep. Farmsteads that had been worked for centuries were abruptly abandoned, allowing the forest to reclaim the fields. This biological catastrophe may have been the deciding factor in the history of England. At the time, the island was locked in a stalemate between the native Britons in the west and the invading Anglo-Saxon tribes in the east. The plague appears to have struck the Britons much harder. Why? Because the Britons traded with the infectious Mediterranean and lived in denser hubs. The Saxons, conversely, lived in smaller, scattered farmsteads and had fewer trade links with the south. They were accidentally quarantined by their own isolation. As the Britons died in their thousands, their defences crumbled. The plague hollowed out the western kingdoms, leaving empty lands and silent forts. It is no coincidence that after 550 AD, the Saxon advance, which had been halted for decades, possibly by the historical Arthur figure at Baden Hill, suddenly resumed with unstoppable speed. The plague didn't just kill 50% of the population, it fundamentally rewrote the genetic and political map of the island. It cleared the board, allowing a new culture to sweep into the void left by the dead. The silence that fell over Britain wasn't peace. It was the quiet of a graveyard waiting for new tenants. The tragedy of the Justinian plague was not just that it struck once, but that it refused to leave. Like a forest fire that smoulders underground only to flare up again, the pestilence returned in sickening waves. In 558, 573, and on for nearly 2 centuries. A child born in the shadow of the first outbreak would grow up only to see their own children taken by the second or third wave. This relentless assault kept the population of Europe and England suppressed, preventing any chance of recovery. The demographic collapse was so severe that it effectively broke the spine of the ancient world. The complex, interconnected economy of the Roman era simply disintegrated. With half the workforce dead, there were no longer enough engineers to maintain the aqueducts, no longer enough stonemasons to repair the great roads, and no longer enough soldiers to man the walls. In England, the great stone villas of the Roman period weren't just abandoned. They became objects of superstitious fear. The incoming Anglo-Saxons, looking upon the decaying bathhouses and towering stone arches of cities like Bath or London, famously called them emptied, the work of giants. They could not conceive that ordinary men had built such things, because the knowledge and the manpower to create them had died in the delirium of the plague. The geopolitical consequences were permanent. Emperor Justinian's dream of reuniting the Roman Empire died in the hospital beds of Constantinople. His armies, starved of recruits and funds, could not hold Italy or the West. The plague drew a hard biological line between the ancient world and the Middle Ages. It shifted the center of power away from the Mediterranean, which had become a plague reservoir, and toward the north, where the colder climate and lower population density offered some slight protection. In Britain, this accelerated the Germanization of the island. As the native British systems collapsed under the weight of disease and depopulation, the Anglo-Saxon culture, warrior-based, localized, and rural, became dominant. The very language we speak today, English, owes its supremacy in part to this microbial conqueror that silenced the Celtic and Latin tongues of the previous order. The genetic map of the British Isles was rewritten not just by the sword, but by the flea. By the time the pandemic finally burned itself out in the 8th century, the world was unrecognizable. The sun had returned, but the civilization underneath it had changed forever. Estimates suggest that between the volcanic winter and the plague, the global population may have dropped by hundreds of millions. In Europe, it would take almost 1,000 years until the high medieval period for the population to return to pre-plague levels. This was the true apocalypse. It wasn't a sudden explosion, but a slow, agonizing suffocation of the old way of life. Yet, in the empty spaces, left by the dead, a new Europe began to grow. Feudal, fractured, and fiercely resilient. The 541 AD event reminds us that civilization is fragile, held together by the health of its people. The Dark Ages were not dark because of a lack of intelligence. They were dark because the lights went out, one life at a time, until half the world was gone.